The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky outpost in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez wiped the sweat from her brow as she adjusted her rifle scope for the third time that morning. Around her, the other Marines in Bravo Company were growing restless. They had been pinned down by enemy fire for nearly 6 hours, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Maria had joined the Marines 5 years earlier, fresh out of high school in El Paso, Texas. She was the daughter of immigrant parents who worked double shifts at a local factory to make ends meet. When she told her father she wanted to serve her country, he had tears in his eyes. Her mother had worried constantly, lighting candles at church every Sunday for her daughter's safe return. The call to become a sniper hadn't come easily. Maria had to fight for every opportunity in a world dominated by men. She was smaller than most of her fellow Marines, standing just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Her training at Camp Pendleton had been brutal. The instructors pushed every candidate to their breaking point, and many washed out within the first few weeks. Maria remembered the day she first held a sniper rifle, feeling its weight in her hands. The M40A5 seemed massive compared to her slight frame, but she had practiced for hours until it felt like an extension of her body. The shooting range became her second home. While other Marines relaxed during their free time, Maria could be found perfecting her breathing techniques, studying wind patterns, and calculating bullet trajectories. Her instructors noticed her dedication, but they also noticed something troubling. Despite her technical knowledge and steady hands, Maria struggled with accuracy during live fire exercises. Time and time again, she would line up her shots perfectly, control her breathing, and squeeze the trigger with textbook precision. Yet somehow, her bullets would miss their targets by mere inches. It was as if some invisible force was deflecting her shots at the last moment. Her fellow trainees began to whisper among themselves, wondering if she had what it took to be a sniper. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her primary instructor, had served 3 tours in Iraq and had seen hundreds of potential snipers come through the program. He recognized something special in Maria, even if her marksmanship scores didn't reflect it. There was an intensity in her eyes, a focus that couldn't be taught. He decided to give her additional training time, working with her one-on-one to identify the problem. During one particular training session, Rodriguez noticed that Maria's shots were consistently off by the same margin. It wasn't a random pattern of misses. There was something systematic about it. He suspected that her rifle scope might be slightly misaligned, but multiple checks revealed it to be perfectly calibrated. The mystery deepened with each passing day. Maria's confidence began to waver. She had always excelled at everything she put her mind to, from academics to physical training. The possibility of failing at something so crucial to her military career was devastating. She called home less frequently, unable to face the disappointment in her parents' voices if they knew she was struggling. The other sniper candidates started to distance themselves from her, as if her poor marksmanship might be contagious. She ate meals alone, spent her free time in isolated training, and pushed herself harder than ever before. Sleep became elusive as she replayed every missed shot in her mind, analyzing each variable that might have contributed to her failures. One evening, while cleaning her rifle in the barracks, Maria discovered something that changed everything. As she disassembled the weapon for routine maintenance, she noticed a tiny imperfection in the barrel that had gone undetected by standard inspections. It was so small that it required a magnifying glass to see clearly, but it was enough to affect the bullet's trajectory by just enough to cause consistent misses. When Rodriguez examined the rifle the next morning, he was amazed that Maria had found something that multiple armory specialists had missed. The barrel was replaced immediately, and Maria was scheduled for a requalification shoot. Her hands trembled slightly as she loaded the first round, knowing that this moment would determine whether she could continue with sniper training. The first shot rang out across the desert range, and the target spotter called out a perfect bullseye. Maria felt a surge of relief so powerful that she nearly cried. The second shot was equally perfect, as was the third. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing all the skill and training she had accumulated over months of practice. Rodriguez watched with pride as Maria completed the course with the highest scores in her class. He had seen many talented shooters over the years, but few had shown such persistence in the face of repeated failure. Maria's character had been forged in the crucible of adversity, and he knew she would be a formidable sniper in combat. The graduation ceremony was small but meaningful. Maria's parents had driven from Texas to watch their daughter receive her sniper certification. Her father, a man of few words, simply nodded with approval when she showed him her certificate. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering prayers of protection in Spanish. Within weeks of graduation, Maria received orders for deployment to Afghanistan. Bravo Company was being sent to one of the most dangerous regions in the country, where Taliban fighters had been launching increasingly bold attacks on coalition forces. The mission was clear: provide overwatch and eliminate high-value targets that threatened the safety of fellow Marines. The flight to Afghanistan was Maria's first time outside the United States. As the transport plane descended through the mountains, she looked out at the rugged landscape below and wondered what challenges awaited her. The other snipers in her unit were seasoned veterans who had already proven themselves in combat. She was the newcomer, the unknown quantity who would have to earn their respect through actions, not words. The forward operating base where Bravo Company was stationed was a collection of fortified buildings surrounded by high walls and razor wire. The accommodations were sparse, but Maria had grown accustomed to military life. What struck her most was the constant tension in the air, the knowledge that enemy forces could attack at any moment. Her first weeks in country were relatively quiet, filled with routine patrols and observation duties. Maria studied the terrain around their base, memorizing every ridge, valley, and potential hiding spot that enemy fighters might use. She practiced range estimations constantly, turning the endless waiting into opportunities for skill development. The other Marines in her company began to accept her as they witnessed her professionalism and dedication. She never complained about the harsh conditions or the long hours of guard duty. During her off-duty time, she would clean her rifle meticulously, ensuring that every component was in perfect working order. Lance Corporal Johnson, a fellow sniper who had been in Afghanistan for 8 months, became something of a mentor to Maria. He shared his knowledge of local fighting tactics and taught her how to read the subtle signs that indicated enemy movement in the distance. Johnson had earned his reputation through numerous successful missions, and Maria absorbed every piece of advice he offered. The real test came during her first combat patrol. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban fighters had been moving through a nearby village, and Bravo Company was tasked with conducting a sweep operation. Maria was assigned to provide overwatch from a hilltop position while the rest of the company moved through the village streets below. As she settled into position behind her rifle, Maria felt her heart rate increase despite her training. The scope revealed a complex maze of buildings and alleyways where any number of threats could be hiding. She controlled her breathing and began systematically scanning for targets, knowing that the lives of her fellow Marines depended on her vigilance. The patrol below moved methodically from house to house, searching for weapons caches and gathering intelligence from local residents. Through her scope, Maria watched their progress and maintained constant communication with the company commander. Everything seemed routine until a voice crackled over the radio with words that sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. Contact. Enemy fighters had opened fire on the patrol from multiple positions within the village. Maria immediately began scanning for muzzle flashes and movement that would indicate enemy positions. She could see Marines taking cover behind walls and vehicles, returning fire as best they could while under heavy assault. The first target appeared in her scope, a fighter moving between buildings approximately 400 meters away. Maria calculated the distance, adjusted for wind, and prepared to take her first combat shot. Her finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, steady squeeze that had been drilled into her during countless hours of training. The shot echoed across the valley, but the target continued moving. Maria had missed. She quickly chambered another round and reacquired the target, but by then, the fighter had disappeared into the maze of buildings. Frustration began to build as she realized that her training range problems might be following her into combat. More targets appeared as the firefight intensified. Maria engaged each one with precision and care, following all the protocols she had learned. Yet shot after shot seemed to miss by the narrowest of margins. Her fellow Marines were counting on her to provide accurate fire support, and she was failing them when they needed her most. Johnson's voice came over the radio, calm despite the chaos around him. He offered quick tips about reading the wind and adjusting for the different atmospheric conditions, but Maria's confidence was already shaken. The psychological pressure of combat was unlike anything she had experienced during training. As the firefight continued, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. Enemy fighters were beginning to flank the patrol, moving through positions that would allow them to attack her fellow Marines from behind. She called out warnings over the radio, but the patrol was already heavily engaged and had limited ability to reposition. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a crushing burden. These weren't training targets or paper silhouettes. They were enemy fighters who wanted to kill her brothers and sisters in arms. Every missed shot potentially meant another Marine might not return home to their family. Maria took a deep breath and tried to clear her mind of doubt and fear. She remembered her father's words from childhood. Mija, when life gets difficult, you don't give up. You find another way. There had to be another way to help her fellow Marines, even if her individual shots weren't finding their marks. The opportunity came when she spotted a group of 3 enemy fighters positioning themselves behind a low stone wall. They were approximately 300 meters away, preparing to launch a coordinated attack on the exposed flank of the patrol. Maria realized that this might be her moment to make a difference, to prove that she belonged among the elite snipers of the Marine Corps. She studied the position carefully, noting the spacing between the fighters and the materials they were using for cover. The stone wall was old and weathered, held together more by gravity than structural integrity. An idea began to form in her mind, one that would require perfect timing and a level of precision she had never achieved in combat. The radio chattered with increasing urgency as the patrol reported that they were running low on ammunition. Maria knew that time was running out, both for her fellow Marines and for her own credibility as a sniper. She had trained for this moment her entire military career, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of real combat responsibility. As she prepared for what might be her last chance to contribute meaningfully to the fight, Maria thought about everyone who had believed in her along the way. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had seen something in her that she couldn't see in herself. Her parents had sacrificed so much to give her the opportunity to serve. Her fellow Marines trusted her to watch their backs in the most dangerous situations imaginable. The scope crosshairs settled on the critical point she had identified, and Maria began the breathing routine that would determine whether she succeeded or failed. Everything she had learned, every hour of training, every moment of doubt and determination had led to this single shot. The future of the mission, and possibly the lives of her fellow Marines, hung in the balance as her finger began the final pressure on the trigger. The morning after the failed mission, Maria sat alone in the communications bunker, staring at her rifle with a mixture of anger and disappointment. The after-action report had been brutal, but fair. Despite her best efforts, she had fired 17 rounds during the firefight and failed to neutralize a single target. 3 Marines had been wounded during the enemy's flanking maneuver, including Lance Corporal Johnson, who had taken shrapnel to his shoulder. Captain Morrison, the company commander, had been understanding but direct in his assessment. Maria was being reassigned to support duties until further notice. She would no longer serve as a primary sniper for combat operations. The decision felt like a knife to her heart, but she couldn't argue with the logic. In combat, results mattered more than good intentions. Johnson found her that evening, his arm in a sling but his spirits surprisingly high. He sat down beside her without saying anything for several minutes, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded their base. Finally, he broke the silence with words that would stay with Maria for the rest of her life. "You know, Gonzalez, I've seen a lot of snipers come and go in my time over here," he said quietly. Some of them were natural shooters who could hit anything they aimed at. Others were technical experts who knew every ballistic table by heart. But the best ones, the ones who really made a difference, they had something else. They had the ability to think differently when everything went wrong. Maria looked at him skeptically. She appreciated his attempt to make her feel better, but the facts were undeniable. She had failed when her fellow Marines needed her most. No amount of encouragement could change that reality. "I'm serious," Johnson continued. "During that firefight yesterday, I watched you through my scope when I wasn't engaging targets. You weren't just randomly shooting and hoping for the best. You were studying the situation, looking for patterns, trying to find a solution. That's not something you can teach." He paused to adjust his sling before continuing. "My grandfather fought in Vietnam as a sniper. He told me once that the difference between a good sniper and a great one isn't how often they hit their target. It's how they adapt when their normal methods aren't working." Over the following weeks, Maria threw herself into her new support role with characteristic determination. She helped maintain equipment, processed intelligence reports, and assisted with training exercises for newly arrived Marines. Although the work was important, She felt like she was watching the war from the sidelines instead of contributing meaningfully to the mission. During her free time, she began studying the technical aspects of ballistics with renewed intensity. She read every manual, research paper, and field report she could find about long-range shooting. Most importantly, she started analyzing her own performance with scientific rigor, documenting every variable that might have contributed to her missed shots. The breakthrough came when she was reviewing footage from helmet cameras worn by Marines during recent patrols. In one particular video, she noticed something that made her pause the playback and rewind several times. A Marine had thrown a fragmentation grenade that struck a wall and bounced off at an unexpected angle before exploding among enemy fighters. The incident sparked an idea that would fundamentally change how Maria approached her role as a sniper. What if missing the target wasn't necessarily a failure? What if the bullet's path after missing could be used strategically to achieve the mission objective? It was an unconventional concept that challenged everything she had learned about precision shooting. She began researching the physics of bullet trajectory, ricochet patterns, and fragmentation effects. Most sniper training focused on direct hits, but Maria started exploring scenarios where indirect effects might be more advantageous. She studied structural engineering principles to understand how different materials would react to high-velocity impacts. The base's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Chun, noticed Maria's research and became intrigued by her unconventional approach. Chun had a background in physics before joining the military, and she appreciated Maria's systematic methodology. Together, they began analyzing enemy tactics and identifying situations where indirect shooting techniques might be applicable. The Taliban fighters have been using a lot of improvised fortifications lately, Chun explained during one of their discussions. Old buildings, stone walls, even abandoned vehicles. They think these positions provide adequate protection against direct fire, but they might be vulnerable to different types of attacks. Maria's new assignment came sooner than expected. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander known for orchestrating attacks on coalition convoys, was meeting with his lieutenants in a village about 10 kilometers from their base. Traditional aerial surveillance was limited due to bad weather, and ground patrols couldn't get close enough without being detected. Captain Morrison approached Maria with a proposal that surprised her. The mission required someone with sniper training to provide reconnaissance and possible fire support, but the primary objective was intelligence gathering rather than elimination. Given her recent struggles with direct engagement, Morrison thought this might be an opportunity for her to rebuild confidence while contributing to an important operation. The team would consist of Maria, Johnson, who had recovered from his wounds, and 2 other Marines specializing in communications and intelligence gathering. They would establish an observation post on high ground overlooking the target village and monitor enemy activity for several days. As they prepared for the mission, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of her first combat deployment. This was her chance to prove that she belonged in the field, even if her role would be primarily observational rather than combative. The infiltration went smoothly, and the team established their position on a rocky hilltop that provided excellent visibility of the village below. Through high-powered optics, they could observe daily routines, count enemy fighters, and identify key buildings where meetings might take place. For 3 days, they maintained constant watch while gathering valuable intelligence about enemy movements and communications. Maria found herself becoming absorbed in the tactical puzzle of understanding how the enemy organized their operations. She documented patrol patterns, noted defensive positions, and identified potential weak points in their security arrangements. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Johnson spotted movement in the village that indicated the arrival of someone important. Several vehicles had approached under cover of darkness, and now armed guards were establishing a security perimeter around the largest building in the village center. Through her scope, Maria could see men in traditional Afghan clothing moving between buildings, but their movements were more disciplined than typical villagers. These were trained fighters trying to appear casual while maintaining tactical awareness. The high-value target had arrived exactly as intelligence had predicted. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled over the radio with updated orders from headquarters. The situation had escalated beyond reconnaissance. Coalition forces had intercepted communications indicating that the Taliban commander was planning a major attack on a nearby American outpost. The mission parameters had changed from observation to direct action. "We need to neutralize the target before he can leave the village," Chen explained. "You're the only sniper in position to take the shot. The nearest support is 40 minutes away, and we can't risk letting him escape. Maria felt her stomach tighten as the weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders once again. Through her scope, she could see the building where the target was located, approximately 600 meters away. It was a challenging shot even under ideal conditions, and her track record with direct engagement was hardly encouraging. Johnson moved closer to provide support and guidance. "Remember what we practiced about reading the wind," he whispered. "The flags on those buildings will tell you everything you need to know about air currents in the valley." Maria studied the target area carefully, noting the multiple levels of the building and the various windows where the target might appear. Intelligence suggested he would be meeting in a room on the second floor, but there was no guarantee about which window he might use or when he would show himself. As she waited for the target to appear, Maria's mind drifted to the research she had been conducting about indirect shooting techniques. The building where the meeting was taking place was old and made of traditional mud brick construction. The walls were thick enough to stop small arms fire, but they might be vulnerable to the right kind of impact. She began studying the structure through her scope, looking for potential weak points where a well-placed shot might cause maximum disruption. There was an old wooden beam supporting part of the second floor that appeared to be under significant stress. If that beam could be damaged, it might cause a partial collapse that would accomplish the mission objective without requiring a direct hit on the target. The idea was risky and unconventional, but it offered a potential solution to her accuracy problems. Instead of trying to hit a moving human target through a window, she could aim for a stationary structural element that was much larger and easier to hit. Johnson noticed her focus shifting to different parts of the building and quietly asked what she was thinking. Maria explained her idea about targeting the support beam, and his initial reaction was skeptical. It wasn't a technique they had trained for, and there was no guarantee it would work. But, Johnson admitted after thinking it over, it might be our best option given the circumstances. You've always been good at seeing solutions that others miss. Maybe this is one of those times when thinking differently is exactly what we need. As if summoned by their discussion, movement appeared in one of the second-floor windows. Through her scope, Maria could see a figure in traditional robes gesturing to others in the room. Intelligence had provided detailed photographs of the target, and the physical characteristics matched perfectly. This was their man. The range was longer than any shot Maria had attempted in combat, and the target was only partially visible through the window. A traditional headshot would require perfect timing and conditions that simply didn't exist. But the wooden support beam she had identified was clearly visible just below the window, and it represented a much larger target. Maria calculated the trajectory needed to hit the beam at the correct angle. The bullet would need to strike with enough force to cause structural damage, but at the right point to ensure maximum effect. It was a complex geometric problem that required her to consider factors no sniper training had ever covered. "I'm going to try something different," Maria told Johnson as she adjusted her scope for the longer range. "If this works, it'll accomplish the mission objective. If it doesn't, we'll have to find another way." Johnson nodded and prepared to spot for her, though he admitted later that he had no idea what to expect. Maria's unconventional approach was either brilliant or completely misguided, and they would find out within seconds. Through her scope, Maria could see the target still moving around the room, unaware that he was being watched from the hilltop above. The wooden beam was centered in her crosshairs, and she began the breathing routine that would steady her aim for the most important shot of her military career. The rifle felt different in her hands this time, not because anything had changed mechanically, but because her entire approach had shifted. She wasn't trying to achieve pinpoint accuracy on a small target. Instead, she was using her rifle as a tool of engineering, applying force to a structural element with the goal of achieving a specific result. As her finger began the final pressure on the trigger, Maria realized that this moment represented more than just a single shot. It was the culmination of months of frustration, analysis, and determination to find a different way to succeed. Whether her unconventional approach would work remained to be seen, but she had never been more confident in her ability to adapt and overcome challenges. The shot broke cleanly, and the bullet raced across the valley toward its target. Maria watched through her scope as the projectile struck exactly where she had aimed, sending splinters flying from the ancient wooden beam. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and she wondered if her calculations had been wrong. Then, with a rumbling sound that could be heard even at their distance, a section of the second floor began to sag. The compromised beam had failed under the load it was supporting, and the floor above was collapsing into the room where the meeting had been taking place. Dust and Debris filled the air as the building's structural integrity was compromised in exactly the way Maria had predicted. The dust cloud that rose from the partially collapsed building obscured Maria's view for several crucial minutes. Through her scope, she could see debris continuing to fall from the damaged structure, but it was impossible to determine the fate of the target or the others who had been in the meeting room. The silence that followed the collapse was broken only by shouts from other buildings in the village as people rushed to investigate the disturbance. Johnson was already on the radio, reporting the successful engagement to headquarters while requesting immediate surveillance assets to assess the damage. Maria kept her rifle trained on the building, watching for any signs of movement that might indicate survivors attempting to escape from the wreckage. "Good thinking with that structural shot," Johnson whispered as they waited for confirmation. "I've never seen anything like it, but it definitely got results. Whether we got our primary target or not, we've definitely disrupted their meeting." As the dust began to settle, Maria could see that her shot had caused more damage than she had initially calculated. The wooden beam she had targeted was a critical load-bearing element, and its failure had triggered a cascade of structural problems throughout that section of the building. What had been a two-story meeting room was now a pile of mud bricks, wooden timbers, and roofing materials. Village residents were beginning to emerge from nearby buildings, but they were keeping their distance from the collapse site. Through her scope, Maria noticed that some of the onlookers were armed, suggesting they were part of the security detail rather than innocent civilians. Their behavior was cautious, but not panicked, which indicated they were experienced fighters rather than ordinary villagers. Lieutenant Chin's voice came through the radio with updated intelligence from intercepted enemy communications. The Taliban fighters in the village were reporting casualties from the building collapse, but they were using code words that made it difficult to determine specific details about who had been injured or killed. "We need to maintain overwatch for at least another hour," Chin instructed. "Intelligence is working on decrypting their communications, and we should have better information about the target's status shortly. Stay sharp and report any movement that might indicate organized evacuation or reinforcement." As they continued their surveillance, Maria found herself analyzing what had just happened from a tactical perspective. Her unconventional shooting technique had achieved the mission objective, but it had also revealed new possibilities for how snipers might engage targets in the future. By thinking beyond direct elimination and considering environmental factors, she had discovered an entirely different approach to precision shooting. Johnson seemed to be having similar thoughts. "You know, Gonzalez, what you just did could change how we think about urban combat. Most of these old buildings in Afghanistan were constructed decades or even centuries ago, using traditional methods that weren't designed to withstand modern warfare. If we could identify structural weak points before missions, we might be able to achieve objectives with fewer direct engagements." The idea intrigued Maria, but she was also aware of the ethical implications. Causing building collapses in populated areas carried risks that direct shooting did not. There was always the possibility of civilian casualties or unintended damage to infrastructure that communities depended upon for survival. "It would have to be used very selectively," she replied quietly. "Only in situations where we could be certain about who was inside and what the secondary effects might be. But you're right that it opens up new tactical options." Movement near the collapsed building caught her attention. Several figures in military-style clothing were moving through the debris, apparently searching for survivors or attempting to recover important materials from the wreckage. Their movements were systematic and organized, suggesting they had training in disaster response or recovery operations. Through her scope, Maria watched as the search team worked their way through the rubble. They were being careful not to disturb the structural stability any further, but they were clearly looking for something or someone specific. After about 20 minutes, they emerged from the debris carrying what appeared to be documents or communications equipment. "Looks like they're conducting some kind of intelligence recovery operation," Maria reported over the radio. "They've pulled several items from the wreckage and are preparing to move them to another location." Lieutenant Chin's response was immediate and urgent. "Do not let them leave with those materials. Whatever they're recovering could contain information about future attacks or other high-value targets. You are authorized to engage." Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with receiving engagement authorization. This time, however, her targets were in an open area where structural shooting techniques wouldn't be applicable. She would need to rely on traditional marksmanship skills that had consistently failed her in previous combat situations. The range to the target area was approximately 500 meters, well within the effective range of her rifle under normal circumstances. However, the figures were moving quickly and unpredictably as they worked to evacuate the recovered materials. Hitting a moving target at that distance would require the kind of precision shooting that had eluded her throughout her military career. Johnson positioned himself to provide spotting support while Maria prepared for engagement. "Take your time and wait for the right opportunity," he advised. "They don't know we're watching, so they're not taking evasive action. Eventually, one of them will present a stable target." As Maria tracked the enemy fighters through her scope, she noticed something that gave her an idea. The group was working around several abandoned vehicles that had been left near the building, apparently as part of the security arrangement. One of the vehicles, an old pickup truck, was positioned in such a way that a well-placed shot might disable it and prevent the enemy from using it to transport the recovered materials. "What if I don't shoot at the people?" Maria asked Johnson. "What if I target their transportation instead? They can't move those materials very far on foot, and disabling their vehicles would accomplish the same objective." Johnson considered the suggestion for a moment before nodding approvingly. "That's actually brilliant. Vehicle engines are much larger targets than human beings, and you don't have to worry about them moving erratically. Plus, we might be able to capture them alive for interrogation if they can't escape." Maria shifted her aim to the pickup truck's engine block, which was clearly visible through her scope. It was a stationary target that measured several feet in each dimension, making it the largest target she had ever engaged in combat. More importantly, hitting it would serve a clear tactical purpose beyond simple elimination of enemy personnel. The shot felt different as she prepared to engage. There was no moral weight about taking a human life, no pressure to achieve pinpoint accuracy on a small target, and no fear that a miss might result in friendly casualties. She was simply using her rifle to disable a piece of equipment, treating it more like a demolition task than a combat engagement. The trigger broke cleanly, and Maria watched through her scope as the bullet struck the engine block with a metallic impact that sent steam and fluid spraying from the damaged cooling system. The truck was clearly disabled, but the enemy fighters were already moving toward another vehicle parked nearby. Without hesitation, Maria chambered another round and shifted her aim to the second vehicle. This shot was equally successful, puncturing the radiator and causing immediate mechanical failure that would prevent the truck from running. The enemy fighters found themselves stranded with no means of rapid transportation. The effect on enemy morale was immediate and dramatic. The fighters began looking around nervously, realizing they were under observation by an unseen sniper who could disable their equipment at will. Some took cover behind the disabled vehicles, while others attempted to identify the source of the incoming fire. "Outstanding shooting," Johnson reported with genuine enthusiasm. "You've effectively trapped them in the target area. Now we can call in support to capture or eliminate them as headquarters directs." Lieutenant Chin's voice came through the radio with new instructions that reflected the changed tactical situation. "Excellent work neutralizing their transportation. Maintain overwatch while we coordinate with nearby patrols to move in and secure the area. Do not let any of them escape with the recovered materials." As they waited for ground support to arrive, Maria reflected on what had just happened. For the first time in her combat career, she had successfully used her rifle to achieve mission objectives. The key had been thinking beyond traditional sniper tactics and finding creative ways to apply her shooting skills to solve tactical problems. "You know what's interesting about this?" Johnson observed as he continued monitoring the trapped enemy fighters. "You're not really having accuracy problems. You're hitting exactly what you aim at. The issue was that you were aiming at the wrong things." The insight struck Maria as profoundly true. Throughout her training and early combat experiences, she had been focused on achieving perfect accuracy according to conventional standards. But combat situations often required adaptability and creative problem-solving rather than textbook precision. Ground support arrived within 30 minutes, consisting of a squad of Marines who had been conducting a patrol in the nearby area. The enemy fighters, realizing they were surrounded and had no means of escape, surrendered without additional resistance. The materials they had recovered from the building collapse were secured and transported back to base for intelligence analysis. The after-action report from this mission painted a dramatically different picture of Maria's capabilities than previous assessments. She had successfully achieved all mission objectives using innovative techniques that demonstrated tactical creativity and effective problem-solving under pressure. Captain Morrison personally commended her performance and recommended that she be returned to active sniper duties. More importantly, the mission had revealed new possibilities for how snipers might operate in complex urban environments. The techniques Maria had developed could be valuable for other Marines facing similar challenges, and headquarters requested that she develop training materials to share her innovations with other sniper units. Over the following weeks, Maria found herself in the unusual position of teaching experienced snipers about unconventional shooting techniques. She developed training exercises that challenged shooters to think beyond direct target elimination and consider environmental factors that might be exploited to achieve mission objectives. The intelligence recovered from the collapsed building proved to be even more valuable than initially expected. Documents and communications equipment revealed details about a planned major offensive against coalition forces, including specific targets, timing, and the identities of key personnel involved in the planning. Maria's contribution to disrupting that intelligence network had potentially saved dozens of American lives, and her innovative approach to the mission had demonstrated that effective snipers needed more than just accurate shooting. They needed to be tactical thinkers who could adapt their methods to meet the specific requirements of each situation. Lieutenant Chun approached Maria one evening with news that would change the trajectory of her military career. Headquarters has been reviewing your recent performance, and they're impressed with your innovative approach to tactical problems. They want you to consider applying for advanced training that would prepare you for special operations assignments. The opportunity represented everything Maria had dreamed of when she first joined the Marine Corps. Special operations units worked on the most challenging and important missions, often operating behind enemy lines with minimal support. It was a chance to serve at the highest level and make a meaningful contribution to national security. However, Maria also recognized that accepting such an assignment would mean leaving behind the unit that had become her family. Johnson, Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Chun, and all the other Marines in Bravo Company had supported her through the most difficult period of her military career. The thought of saying goodbye to them was almost as daunting as the prospect of facing new challenges in special operations. As she considered her options, Maria realized that her experiences over the past few months had taught her something crucial about leadership and teamwork. The best solutions often came from collaboration and mutual support rather than individual achievement. Whatever decision she made about her future, she wanted to ensure that the lessons she had learned would continue to benefit other Marines facing similar challenges. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any rifle she had ever carried, but it also felt like the natural progression of her journey from a struggling sniper trainee to someone who might have something valuable to teach others. The question was whether she was ready to take on that kind of leadership role, and whether she had the courage to leave behind the familiar environment where she had finally found success. As she cleaned her rifle that night, preparing for what might be her final mission with Bravo Company, Maria thought about the letter she would write to her parents. How could she explain that her daughter, who had once struggled to hit a target at close range, was now being considered for elite special operations assignments because she had learned to think differently about what it meant to be a successful sniper? The answer would have to wait until she faced the challenge that was coming with the sunrise, one that would test everything she had learned and determine whether her unconventional approach to warfare could succeed under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The mission briefing came at 0400 hours, delivered by a colonel from intelligence who had flown in specifically to address Bravo Company. The recovered documents from Maria's building collapse operation had revealed something far more serious than anyone had initially realized. The Taliban wasn't just planning isolated attacks. They were coordinating a massive offensive designed to overrun 3 coalition outposts simultaneously. The enemy has been moving personnel and equipment into position for weeks, Colonel Hayes explained to the assembled Marines. They've been using a network of caves and underground tunnels that we didn't know existed. Intelligence estimates they have over 200 fighters prepared to launch coordinated attacks at dawn tomorrow. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she studied the tactical maps spread across the briefing table. The enemy positions were distributed across a wide area that would require multiple sniper teams to cover effectively. More concerning was the fact that many of the fighting positions were in locations that would make traditional direct fire difficult or impossible. The good news, Colonel Hayes continued, is that their operational security has been compromised thanks to the intelligence we recovered. We know their positions, their timing, and their primary objectives. The bad news is that we have less than 18 hours to disrupt their preparations and prevent them from achieving tactical surprise. Captain Morrison stood to address his company. Bravo Company will be responsible for neutralizing enemy positions in Grid Square 77. That includes approximately 40 fighters positioned in caves and reinforced positions along the ridgeline. We'll be working with limited air support due to weather conditions, so this will primarily be a ground operation. As the specific assignments were distributed, Maria learned that she would be working with Johnson and 2 other Marines to establish an overwatch position on the highest peak in the area. Their mission was to provide fire support for the ground assault teams while preventing enemy fighters from using elevated positions to coordinate their defense. The challenging part, Captain Morrison explained privately to Maria after the briefing, is that most of these positions can't be engaged with direct fire. The enemy has chosen their locations specifically because they're protected from conventional attacks. We're going to need creative solutions. Maria spent the remainder of the night studying satellite imagery and topographical maps of the target area. The enemy positions were indeed well chosen from a defensive perspective. Cave entrances were positioned to provide maximum protection while offering excellent fields of fire against approaching coalition forces. Traditional sniper tactics would be largely ineffective against such positions. However, Maria's recent experiences had taught her to look beyond obvious targets and consider environmental factors that might be exploited. As she studied the geological surveys of the area, she noticed something interesting about the rock formations where the enemy had established their positions. The ridgeline was composed primarily of limestone that had been shaped by centuries of erosion. Many of the caves were natural formations that had been expanded by human activity, but they remained dependent on the structural integrity of the surrounding rock. More importantly, the surveys indicated that the rock in several areas was already under stress due to natural weathering and previous seismic activity. "What are you thinking?" Johnson asked as he noticed Maria's intense focus on the geological data. "Look at these stress fracture patterns," Maria replied, pointing to markings on the survey map. "The rock formations above several of these cave positions are already compromised. If we could apply additional stress at the right points, we might be able to cause rock slides that would seal the cave entrances." Johnson studied the maps for several minutes before nodding slowly. "It's possible, but it would require incredible precision. You'd have to hit exactly the right spot with enough force to trigger a failure, but not so much force that you cause unpredictable collateral damage." The idea was ambitious and untested, but it offered a potential solution to an otherwise impossible tactical problem. Maria began calculating the angles and trajectories needed to strike the identified weak points in the rock formations. The shots would be longer and more challenging than anything she had attempted, but the targets were much larger than individual human beings. As dawn approached, the assault teams moved into position while Maria's team established their overwatch post on the peak overlooking the enemy positions. Through her scope, she could see movement in several of the cave entrances as enemy fighters prepared for the expected attack. They appeared confident in their defensive positions and unaware that their locations had been compromised. The first phase of the operation involved conventional suppressive fire to keep enemy fighters pinned in their positions while the assault teams maneuvered into attack positions. Maria watched through her scope as tracers flew back and forth across the valley, marking the beginning of what promised to be a challenging engagement. "Grid 77 Alpha," came the voice of the ground team leader over the radio. "We're taking heavy fire from the cave positions, unable to advance without sniper support to neutralize elevated threats." Maria studied the cave position that was causing problems for the assault team. It was positioned about 40 feet above the valley floor, with a wide entrance that provided excellent protection for the defenders while offering them superior fields of fire. A traditional approach would require her to wait for individual targets to expose themselves, but her geological analysis suggested a different possibility. Above the cave entrance, Maria could see the stress fractures she had identified in the survey data. The rock formation was clearly unstable, held in place primarily by gravity and structural tension that could be disrupted with the right kind of impact. A well-placed shot might trigger a rock slide that would seal the cave while neutralizing the fighters inside. "I'm going to try something unconventional," Maria reported over the radio. "Instead of engaging personnel targets, I'm going to attempt to trigger a rock slide that will neutralize the cave position entirely." The response was immediate skepticism from several voices on the radio net. Deliberately causing rock slides was not a standard military tactic, and there were legitimate concerns about unpredictable secondary effects. However, the ground team leader was facing immediate threats from enemy fire and was willing to authorize any tactic that might help his Marines advance. "Roger, 7-7 Overwatch. You are cleared to engage with unconventional methods. Ground teams will maintain safe distance from potential slide zones." Maria calculated the trajectory needed to hit the critical stress point she had identified in the rock formation. The range was nearly 700 meters, and the target was a specific point no larger than a dinner plate. It would require perfect environmental reading and flawless execution, but success would eliminate an entire enemy fighting position with a single shot. As she prepared to engage, Maria felt a calmness that had eluded her during previous combat operations. She was no longer trying to achieve conventional accuracy standards that had consistently frustrated her. Instead, she was using her rifle as an engineering tool to solve a complex tactical problem that required creativity and innovation. The shot broke cleanly, and Maria watched through her scope as the bullet struck precisely where she had aimed. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and she wondered if her geological analysis had been incorrect. Then, with a rumbling sound that could be heard across the valley, the stressed rock formation above the cave began to shift. What followed exceeded Maria's most optimistic expectations. The initial rockfall triggered a larger slide that not only sealed the cave entrance, but also blocked a secondary position that had been providing covering fire. Tons of limestone crashed down the hillside, creating a cloud of dust that obscured the entire area for several minutes. Outstanding shot, 7-7 Overwatch, came the excited voice of the ground team leader. Cave position is completely neutralized. We're able to advance to Phase 2 objectives. Johnson was staring at Maria with a mixture of amazement and respect. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You just eliminated an entire enemy position with geological warfare. The success of the first rock slide triggered a shift in tactical approach for the entire operation. Other sniper teams began requesting geological survey data for their assigned areas, hoping to identify similar opportunities for unconventional engagement. Maria found herself coordinating with multiple teams to share information about stress fractures and potential slide zones. Over the next 4 hours, she successfully triggered 3 more rock slides that neutralized enemy positions without requiring direct engagement with personnel targets. Each success built her confidence and refined her understanding of how to read geological formations under combat conditions. The technique was not without risks. One attempt failed to achieve the desired result, requiring her to fall back on traditional direct fire methods. Another rock slide was larger than anticipated, creating safety concerns for nearby friendly forces. However, the overall effectiveness of the approach was undeniable. By mid-morning, the enemy offensive had been completely disrupted. The fighters who had not been neutralized by the rock slides found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate their planned attacks. Many surrendered rather than face continued bombardment in untenable positions. Colonel Hayes personally visited Maria's Overwatch position to observe her unconventional techniques firsthand. He watched as she analyzed geological surveys and calculated trajectories for targeting rock formations rather than human beings. The innovation impressed him both tactically and strategically. Sergeant Gonzalez, he said after observing her work for nearly an hour, what you've developed here could change how we approach mountain warfare operations. Have you considered the implications of your techniques beyond this specific engagement? Maria had indeed been thinking about the broader applications of geological targeting. Afghanistan's terrain was predominantly mountainous, with countless cave systems and rock formations that could potentially be exploited using similar methods. However, she was also aware that such techniques required extensive preparation and couldn't be improvised in the field. It would need to be part of mission planning from the beginning, she explained. We need geological surveys, stress analysis, and probably some kind of specialized training for snipers to identify suitable targets. It's not something you could just decide to try during a firefight. The colonel nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of systematic thinking that makes this idea valuable. We need people who can see beyond conventional tactics and develop new approaches to persistent challenges. As the operation wound down and enemy resistance collapsed, Maria realized that she had participated in something historically significant. The techniques she had developed might influence military doctrine for decades to come. More importantly, she had found a way to be effective in combat despite her struggles with traditional marksmanship. The after-action reports generated by the operation would eventually reach the highest levels of military command, sparking discussions about innovative tactics and adaptive leadership in combat operations. Maria's name would be associated with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about how snipers operated in complex terrain. However, the immediate aftermath of the operation brought news that would personally affect Maria more than any strategic implications. Captain Morrison approached her with information that had arrived during the fighting, information that would force her to make the most difficult decision of her military career. The Special Operations Command has accelerated their timeline, Morrison explained. They want you to report for advanced training within the week. This mission has apparently convinced them that your innovative approach to tactical problems is exactly what they need for some upcoming operations. Maria felt torn between excitement and sadness. The opportunity represented the pinnacle of military achievement, a chance to serve at the highest level and contribute to the most important missions. However, leaving Bravo Company meant abandoning the team that had supported her through her struggles and celebrated her successes. Johnson, who had overheard the conversation, approached with his characteristic directness. "You have to go," he said simply. "What you've learned needs to be shared with people who can use it to save lives. This company will be fine, but the larger military needs what you have to offer." As Maria considered her decision, she realized that her journey from struggling marksman to innovative tactician had taught her something crucial about leadership. True success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about finding ways to contribute to something larger than yourself. The choice between staying with her current unit and accepting the special operations assignment would determine not just her future, but potentially the future of how the military approached certain types of combat operations. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any rifle she had ever carried, but it also felt like the natural culmination of everything she had learned about adapting and overcoming challenges. That evening, as she prepared her equipment for what might be her final night with Bravo Company, Maria began composing the letter she would send to her parents. How do you explain to people who have sacrificed everything for your opportunities that their daughter has somehow become someone the military considers essential for special operations? The answer would have to capture not just her tactical innovations, but the deeper lesson she had learned about finding your own path to success when conventional approaches don't work. It was a lesson that applied far beyond military service, and one that might inspire others facing their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. As she wrote, Maria realized that her story was not really about becoming a better shooter. It was about learning to think differently, to adapt when normal methods fail, and to find creative solutions to complex problems. Those skills would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead, whether in special operations or in the civilian world she would eventually return to. The final decision would have to wait until morning, but Maria already knew what choice she would make. The opportunity to serve at a higher level and potentially influence military doctrine was too important to refuse. The question was whether she was truly ready for the responsibilities that would come with such an assignment. 6 months later, Maria found herself in a classified location preparing for a mission that would test everything she had learned about unconventional warfare. Her acceptance into special operations had led to intensive training in advanced tactics, demolitions, and psychological operations. More importantly, she had been assigned to a team developing new doctrines for what military planners were calling environmental warfare. The target was a terrorist compound built into a mountainside in a region she couldn't discuss with anyone outside her unit. Intelligence indicated that the facility housed a bomb-making operation responsible for attacks on civilian targets across 3 countries. Traditional assault methods would result in heavy casualties on both sides, and aerial bombardment risked destroying evidence needed to identify other terrorist cells. The challenge, explained Major Davidson, the mission commander, is that the compound is essentially a fortress built into solid rock. They've spent years reinforcing it with modern materials while using the natural cave system for protection. Direct assault is practically impossible, and we can't risk letting them destroy their equipment and escape through hidden tunnels. Maria studied the intelligence photos and geological surveys with the expertise she had developed over months of specialized training. The compound was indeed formidable from a defensive perspective, but her trained eye began to identify potential vulnerabilities that conventional military analysis might miss. The terrorists had made a crucial error in their construction planning. While they had reinforced the main entrance and living areas, they had built their bomb-making workshop in a natural cavern that depended entirely on the structural integrity of the surrounding limestone. More critically, the workshop was positioned directly beneath a massive boulder that had been balanced on the mountainside for centuries. What if we don't attack the compound directly? Maria suggested during the mission planning session. What if we attack the mountain itself? The concept she proposed was ambitious beyond anything she had attempted before. By targeting specific geological weak points in a carefully calculated sequence, It might be possible to cause a controlled landslide that would seal the compound while preserving the workshop area for intelligence recovery. It would require perfect timing and unprecedented precision, but it offered a solution that could achieve all mission objectives simultaneously. Major Davidson was initially skeptical of the plan's feasibility, but Maria's track record with geological warfare had earned her credibility within special operations circles. More importantly, conventional alternatives all carried unacceptable risks of casualty or intelligence loss. How confident are you that this approach would work? Davidson asked after reviewing Maria's detailed analysis. Based on the geological surveys and my experience with similar operations, I'd estimate an 80% probability of success, Maria replied. The risks are primarily related to timing and environmental factors that we can control through proper mission planning. The approval process for such an unconventional operation required authorization from the highest levels of military command. Maria found herself briefing generals and intelligence officials about concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about how military force should be applied. The presentations were intimidating, but her practical experience gave her confidence in her analysis. 2 weeks later, Maria was lying prone on a rocky outcropping nearly 2 kilometers from the target compound, preparing to execute the most complex shooting sequence of her career. The mission required her to fire 6 specific shots in precise order, each one designed to trigger geological effects that would contribute to the overall plan. Her spotter for this mission was Gunnery Sergeant Adams, a veteran of dozens of special operations who had initially been skeptical of Maria's unconventional methods. However, weeks of training and preparation had convinced him that her approach offered unique advantages for certain types of targets. Environmental conditions are optimal, Adams reported as he monitored wind speed, temperature, and atmospheric pressure. All surveillance assets confirm the target area is clear of civilians. You are cleared to commence engagement sequence. Maria's first shot was aimed at a stress fracture in the rock formation approximately 50 meters above the compound's main entrance. The bullet struck precisely where intended, creating a small rockfall that would appear to be natural weathering to anyone observing from inside the compound. More importantly, it shifted the load distribution in the rock face in preparation for the subsequent shots. The second and third shots targeted support points for the massive boulder that dominated the mountainside above the workshop area. These shots required calculations that accounted for the cumulative effects of previous impacts, treating the entire mountain as a complex engineering problem rather than a series of independent targets. Excellent shooting, Adams whispered as he observed the effects through high-powered optics. The boulder is showing signs of instability, but it's still holding position as planned. Ready for Phase 2. Phase 2 involved targeting the geological features that would control the direction and extent of the landslide. Maria's shots needed to create a failure pattern that would direct falling rock toward specific areas while preserving others. It was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle where each piece affected all the others. The fourth shot triggered a small avalanche that sealed several escape routes while leaving the main workshop area intact. The sound of falling rock echoed across the valley, but from the compound's perspective, it would appear to be another example of the natural erosion that constantly shaped the mountainside. Through her scope, Maria could see figures moving inside the compound, but they showed no signs of alarm or awareness that they were under attack. The genius of geological warfare was that it appeared to be natural phenomena rather than deliberate military action, allowing for complete tactical surprise. Target 5, Adams called out as Maria prepared for the most critical shot in the sequence. This bullet needed to sever the final structural element supporting the massive boulder, but with precise timing to ensure it fell in exactly the right direction. Maria's breathing routine was automatic now, refined through hundreds of hours of practice and dozens of combat operations. Her finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, steady pressure that would release forces capable of reshaping the landscape. The shot broke cleanly, and, for a moment, the mountainside appeared unchanged. Then, with a sound like thunder, the massive boulder began to move. What followed was a carefully orchestrated geological event that took less than 30 seconds but represented months of planning and preparation. The boulder's movement triggered a cascade of smaller rocks that filled the compound's main entrance while leaving emergency exits intact. Simultaneously, falling debris sealed the ventilation shafts that the terrorists might have used to destroy evidence or escape through hidden passages. Most critically, the workshop area remained structurally sound and accessible for intelligence recovery. Phase 3 complete. Adams reported with undisguised amazement. Target area is sealed as planned, with minimal collateral damage to surrounding terrain. I've never seen anything like it. Maria continued monitoring the target area through her scope while ground teams moved in to secure the compound and recover intelligence materials. The terrorists inside were effectively trapped but alive, unable to destroy their bomb-making equipment or escape through the tunnel network they had spent years developing. The intelligence recovery operation yielded unprecedented insights into terrorist bomb-making techniques and identified cell leaders in multiple countries. More importantly, it demonstrated that environmental warfare could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military tactics could not accomplish. The after-action reports from this mission would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Maria's techniques were incorporated into training curricula at multiple special operations schools, and her innovation sparked research into geological warfare applications across different terrain types. However, the personal impact of the mission was even more significant than its tactical implications. Maria had proven to herself and others that unconventional thinking could solve problems that appeared insurmountable through traditional approaches. The shy girl from El Paso who had struggled to hit targets on a training range had become someone capable of reshaping battlefields through creativity and determination. 6 months after the compound operation, Maria received orders that would change her life once again. She was being assigned to the newly created Environmental Warfare Development Program, where she would lead efforts to train other service members in geological targeting techniques while continuing to refine the doctrine she had pioneered. The assignment represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with frustration and failure on a sniper training range. Through persistence, innovation, and willingness to think differently, Maria had not only overcome her personal challenges but had contributed something meaningful to military science. On her final day with the Special Operations Unit, Major Davidson presented Maria with a commendation that recognized her contributions to developing new tactical approaches. More importantly, he shared something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Sergeant Gonzalez," he said, "what you've accomplished goes beyond military innovation. You've demonstrated that there are always alternative solutions to difficult problems, if you have the courage to look for them. That's a lesson that applies far beyond warfare." As Maria prepared for her new assignment, she thought about the letter she would finally be able to send to her parents. She could tell them that their daughter had found her own unique way to serve her country, one that didn't require her to be the best at traditional methods, but allowed her to excel by thinking differently. The story she would share with them wasn't about becoming a better shooter, although her accuracy had improved dramatically once she stopped trying to fit conventional expectations. It was about learning that success often requires finding your own path when the standard approaches don't work. More importantly, it was about discovering that apparent failures can become stepping stones to achievements you never imagined possible. Maria's struggles with traditional marksmanship had forced her to develop innovative approaches that ultimately proved more valuable than conventional skills. The Environmental Warfare Development Program would give Maria the opportunity to teach other service members that effectiveness in combat often comes from adaptability rather than adherence to established procedures. Some of the most significant military innovations throughout history had come from individuals who were willing to question conventional wisdom and explore alternative approaches. As she packed her equipment for the transition to her new assignment, Maria reflected on how much her understanding of success had changed since her early days in sniper training. She had learned that true expertise wasn't just about mastering established techniques. It was about developing the ability to create new solutions when existing methods proved inadequate. The rifle that had once felt like a burden now felt like a tool of unlimited possibility. Maria had discovered that with the right mindset and enough creativity, even the most challenging problems could be solved. It was a lesson that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead, whether in her continued military service or in the civilian career she would eventually pursue. Years later, when Maria would speak to young Marines struggling with their own challenges, she would tell them that missing every shot had been the best thing that ever happened to her career. It had forced her to find her own way to contribute, and that path had led to achievements she never could have imagined. The girl who couldn't hit a target had become a woman who could move mountains with a single bullet. It was a transformation that proved the power of persistence, innovation, and the courage to redefine what success looks like when conventional approaches fall short. In her final report to Special Operations Command, Maria wrote that the most important lesson she had learned was that there are always multiple solutions to any tactical problem. The key is having the vision to see beyond obvious approaches and the determination to develop alternatives that others might consider impossible. That philosophy would guide her throughout the remainder of her military career and into civilian life, where she would continue finding innovative solutions to complex challenges. The sniper who missed every shot until she learned to hit everything that mattered had become proof that sometimes the best path to success is the one nobody else is taking.